Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Nadia Jones, and I serve as Chief Content Officer for Griffin House and Kaplan Early Learning Company. And it is my pleasure, along with my colleague, Dr. Laura Bailett, that we bring to you a webinar that is entitled Beginning Again, Charting a Path Forward for Children, Families, and Professionals. So you are truly in for a treat today as we have a wonderfully diverse and exciting panel of professionals from the field that are going to be sharing a little bit about what next steps are and how we can support one another and grow together post-COVID. And so we really look forward to having this discussion with you. So a few things, we know there's going to be a lot of questions, a lot of comments and things like that. So if you wouldn't mind using the chat box to send us any questions that you have that you'd like to ask the panelists, we will reserve 30 minutes at the end of the panel discussion. This panel discussion ends at 4 p.m. and we will reserve 30 minutes for Q&A. So from 4 p.m. to 4:30. So please put any questions that you have there in the chat box. And otherwise, we just really look forward to having this conversation with you. So I will pass next to my colleague, Dr. Laura Bailett, who will introduce our panelists.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited about this amazing group of panelists to talk about such an important topic. So I am the Chief Academic Officer at Kaplan Early Learning Company. And now I'll just ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. We'll start with Dr. Chester.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Joy Chester. I am a program officer at the Children's Opportunity Fund that is right outside the DC area in Montgomery County, Silver Spring, Maryland. And I also bring a wealth of knowledge from the traditional K-12 environment, as well as teacher, counselor, special education, administrator, local and international. So happy to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Chester. And now Dr. Hegde.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Archana Hegde. I'm a professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Science at East Carolina University. I'm a former teacher and now a teacher educator. So thank you for having me on the panel.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hegde. How about Dr. Worry?
Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Worry. I am the Senior Director of Early Learning at the Hunt Institute, which is located in Cary, North Carolina. We are an education policy resource to governors, state lawmakers, and others, senior state elected leaders across the country. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Worry. And Dr. Morales-Alexander?
Good afternoon. I'm super excited to be here. That's the first thing. My name is Dr. Yasmin Morales-Alexander, and I am an assistant professor at the City University of New York, Lehman College in the Bronx. And like Dr. Archana, I too was a former teacher and director and assistant teacher and the person who cleaned up if the person who cleaned up didn't show up and so on and so forth. And now I am a teacher educator, and I am particularly interested in working with pre-service teachers around understanding family engagement and child development in a sociocultural context and supporting teacher identity development. So thank you for having me on this panel.
And we have one other panelist, Dr. Ginger Welch. She's having a little technical difficulty getting in, but hopefully she will be able to join us momentarily. But we don't want to waste a minute of time with these experts that we do have here. So we're going to go ahead and start. You know, I would just like to say that the genesis of this panel webinar today really came from Dr. Jones and I talking about the very important topic of, as we hopefully are emerging from the pandemic and children are going back to school full time and educators are getting back into their classrooms, you know, there can be a lot of stress and worry around that. First of all, just physically being with people again is different than what we've all experienced for the past year. And so much has changed. And so we pulled this panel together to really focus in on two things. We know so much about how to do this well. And so what can we draw from that we already know, that's already in our wheelhouse, because we're not starting from scratch. And so that should be reassuring for people. On the other hand, a lot of things have changed and a lot of things will be different. So where do we need to think and behave differently potentially as we all start to come back together? And then the other thing that I just think about all the time as a child psychologist and worked in pediatric healthcare for so many years, and really think about population health a lot. And I think that no matter what else we do well, if we don't really do a great job, as everyone is starting to come back together, of reaffirming and building trusting relationships, the rest of it is not going to work very well. And that's really the heart of it. And I know these folks are going to talk about that as we go forward. So with that, I think we're off. And Dr. Jones, you can lead us off from here.
All right. I did see one question in the chat, so I'll mention that the session will be recorded, and so that will be sent to everyone who is registered. So not to worry if you have to hop off early, you will have a chance to go back and review it. So without further ado, our first question is for Drs. Hegde and Dr. Worry. The question is, our title references beginning again. And so in terms of social emotional needs of children and families, what do you think is the same? And what do you think is different compared with pre-pandemic?
If it's okay, Dr. Worry, I'm going to start out. Truly, Nadia, that was such a powerful question. And I tried to wrap my head around what it was like pre-pandemic. I really couldn't think of anything. I think I truly have a COVID brain, and I acknowledge it. And I truly acknowledge it. And today what I'm going to address is partly informed by research, partly my own lived experience. I have a child in middle school and elementary school. So let me tell you what I have heard from parents, their socio-emotional needs and their struggles. I think just like teachers, families had to adapt to, the new protocols, social distancing, maintaining hygiene, washing hands, all new protocols that they had to follow. And also, the transition from face-to-face to online learning has been the most difficult for parents, truly, because, it's not just about online learning. What I heard initially, and the panel can correct me here, is many of the families did not have technology. I mean, they did not have the resources. Again, I know we are going to talk a lot about inequities, but, a lot of families did not have the gadgets that they needed for online learning, no reliable internet, to transition their children. So imagine how stressful that was for the families. And then new modalities of learning, like, how do I navigate Google Classroom? How do I navigate Seesaw, Jamboard? Everything is thrown to me, and for me as a parent, it was like, how do I help my 7-year-old understand email? That was really, really difficult, and here I have he has a parent who is an educator, and I still, I worried about my child every single day. I think parents have really grieved loss of quality time. I have a lot of friends who are essential workers, frontline workers. Now they were not only a parent, they were also becoming teachers, and they're not teachers. So there was a lot of confusion that I always heard, and a lot of guilt associated with that. And again, the panels can, talk about that, but that is something, the only thing I kept hearing is, I'm not a teacher. And it added an extra burden on the teachers to reassure parents, saying, you guys are doing a great job. We appreciate your support. I could see that, it was like going back and forth between teachers and parents. It was a very difficult decision for many parents to decide whether they can send their children to school or not, depending on the county, depending on the state. The decisions had to be made quickly without any information. That was extremely hard as a parent. That's a very difficult decision, because you know what works for your child, right? You know your child's personality, but there was no time for you to make a decision. And I do a lot of research on social network, and I'm a huge fan of social network. And when I say social network, is how other parents can support you, right? That is wonderful. But in COVID, what I saw is that social network sometimes created guilt in the parents. And I'll tell you how, because if I chose to send my child face to face, people looked at me with the feeling that, do you know if you're doing a right decision or not? Are you putting your child's life at risk? Imagine, I'm already feeling so guilty. I'm already so confused. And now I have more eyes looking at me. I think parents have gone through a lot. I truly believe in resilience, and we'll talk about that. But it has been a really difficult time for parents, and we have to acknowledge that going forward. I think we have learned a lot from this, but it's been hard. And for children, loss of playtime, increased screen time, death in the family, malnutrition. I mean, worldwide, if you look at the literature, it's been the most difficult time for the children per se. So it's again a loaded question, and those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Dr. Hegde, I would definitely agree that it is a really complicated question. I think, as with so many other areas, the pandemic has really highlighted inequities. And I think that frankly, that where children are in terms of their social emotional development really begs the question of which children and in what context have they been living over the past year. I think we, in the media, we have seen a lot of depictions of the challenges during COVID-19, but candidly, there are likely children for whom this has been a very positive experience. I mean, there are children who, are in middle and upper income families whose parents have, been called on primarily to work from home over the past year, who may have had some changes to the style of learning that they would have otherwise been exposed to. But hopefully under good circumstances with engaged parents, this may have been a gift. As a parent myself, I feel like the past year has been a very special experience to spend time with my wife and my own children in the home. So I don't think that we can say as a blanket rule that the social emotional needs of children have been adversely affected. But also fair to say that there are many, many children prior to the pandemic who didn't live in those kind of more idyllic circumstances. And I think very safe to say that there are more children now that have experienced, some form of crisis over the past year than was the case even pre-pandemic. Families have experienced a tremendous amount of loss over the past year, and it just whether we're talking about kind of literally the loss of a loved one due to the pandemic, or on a lesser scale, but still very meaningfully loss of access to to grandparents and extended family and friends. Families have lost employment. Families have lost income, and so the pandemic has, in some cases, inserted new crisis into the lives of families who may not have been experiencing it previously, but also has certainly exacerbated the stressors already facing so many families in the country. And I think that is a story again of inequity. I think I referenced kind of upper and middle class families who may have been able to work from a home office and just kind of move through the pandemic quite comfortably. But we recognize that those in our lower income roles in particular, who may have had the most burdens on them to begin with, have really not had the luxury of working remotely during the pandemic. They are most likely to have been working in person throughout, to have been exposed potentially to to COVID itself, to lack health benefits, to lack things like even fundamental as paid sick leave. And so it's very different stories. And I think we have to look through kind of different lenses as we're asking this question about the social emotional needs of kids and families. But in terms of what's different versus what's the same, I mean, I would tell you that from my perspective, the thing that is the same and will always be the same is that young children learn in a particular way and have particular developmental needs that need to be met. Families have gone through very challenging crises. I mean, you think about war and violence and some of the horrible circumstances that children and families have managed somehow to productively survive over the years. I think we will see a lot of resilience coming out of the pandemic, but certainly a lot of need to take each child where they are and lift them up and give them the time and attention and love that they need.
Thank you. All right. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Bailey.
We do have Dr. Ginger Welch who has joined us. And Dr. Welch, you missed the initial introductions, but if you can just, for the benefit of our audience, tell us a little bit about yourself, very brief, and then we will continue on. But welcome, we're so glad you're here.
Glad to be here with you today, and I apologize for being late. My name is Dr. Ginger Welch. I'm a clinical associate professor at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and a private practice child psychologist.
Great, thank you. And I'm monitoring the chat. That's one of my roles today. And I just would say thank you for all the wonderful greetings. And I am so pleased to tell you that we're having people join literally from around the world. We've got people from Saudi Arabia, from Russia, and certainly all over the United States. There may be other countries as well that I haven't seen a posting from, but it's just a great reminder that this is completely a worldwide experience. We are not unique in the United States in the impact of this. It's worldwide. And I think that speaks to the magnitude of the challenge, but also very much that we are all in this together. So Nadia, back to you.
All right, so we will move right on to our next question so we can get through them. We have some great ones for you. I will jump to Dr. Morales-Alexander and then back to you, Dr. Welch. And the question is, what are you seeing and hearing about the social emotional state of early childhood providers? So that one can go to you, Dr. Morales-Alexander, and then to you, Dr. Welch. Your question is, how are they doing? What do we need to know and understand or pay attention to as they are physically re-entering their classrooms?
So it's so loaded. I just want to say that my response is going to be on the shoulders of Dr. Archana and Dr. Worry, because everything that they said is fundamental to what Dr. Chester and I are going to kind of continue in terms of the conversation. Certainly, stress, right? And so it's in addition to kind of the adjectives that were already described, it's this confusion and disorientation and fear and anxiety. What's next? What do we do? Families experiencing that for sure, just in terms of the unknown, juggling, and children who kind of take their cues from adults, right? And so if the adult is stressed out and exhibiting or manifesting these feelings, the children internalize that, right? And so they too are experiencing anxiety and confusion and some, disorientation. And I think above all else, I would say kind of like this level of grief for kind of the human touch, right? And just how much, I think if this pandemic hasn't kind of highlighted anything, it's highlighted how much we need people. And it doesn't stop, once, we leave school or once we're not young children anymore. But I do want to specifically couch my response based on what I know, right? And what my experience is and what my context is. New York City, probably one of the more culturally, racially, ethnically diverse cities in the world, at the same time is deeply segregated. And so this segregation kind of really brings to the fore or really highlights some of these challenges that families and children and providers are kind of experiencing as they enter into classrooms. And so I think particularly about immigrant families who really rely a lot on these social networks, right? Like this is their day-to-day existence, even pre-COVID. And so now the pandemic adds an extra layer of stress to that, right? Like these networks are somewhat fragmented. If I can't connect with my network physically because there's a social distance rule or law, I lose the knowledge, right? We talk about funds of knowledge. I lose the knowledge, I lose access, I lose resources. And so it's one of the things that I think, we need to consider or certainly take into consideration as we kind of move back into whatever this new normal is. But thinking about things like food pantries, other types of auxiliary services, right? Like even how do we carpool? How do we get to work? How do we create even like childcare outside of school? Those kinds of things that perhaps pre-pandemic were established within these social networks and now are kind of like blown out of the water. In terms of what I think children kind of moving back into schools, kind of what Dr. Worry said, just there's certain truths, universal truths about child development. They need play, they need social interaction, they need language-rich environments, and that's never, they need routines and consistency, and that's never gonna change regardless of what is happening around us. And I will say, other things to consider in terms of this move going in is let's think about the physical environment, right? Classrooms themselves, spaces themselves. How about a classroom with windows, right? And I say that because all too often, I mean, how many, childcare visits I've done, and they're like walking me down to a basement and it's dank and it's dark and there's no windows and poor ventilation. So something as basic as windows. Another thing to consider is class size, right? So because of, again, the social distancing protocols that have been put in place, I certainly in New York City, class size has gone down incredibly. I mean, we're talking in a typical preschool classroom, we're talking 18 to 20 children pre-pandemic, and now it's 6 to 10. And as an early childhood educator and practitioner, I'm like, that's the number it should have been all along. And so it makes a difference, right? Bigger is not necessarily better. So and the last thing that I will say in terms of things to consider, kind of moving into classroom that I think would benefit all, is really rethinking assessments and what that means. How are we assessing children? Why are we assessing children? I know that here we postponed, state tests. The State Department of Education said, no state testing, and I mean, we're living to tell the story, right? And so I think that is definitely worth considering.
Thank you, Dr. Welch.
I 100% agree that when you said stressed, that is the first word that came to my mind as I've visited with childcare providers around the country. Stress was something that came up 100% of the time when we visited. And the other word that came to mind for me was innovation. And that was a thing that consistently floored me. I can't say I was surprised by the stress levels that I encountered while I've been working with people in the last year, but the innovation just blew me away. It was, to some extent, it was like childcare providers were poised to unleash their creativity and relate to families in new ways. And it was incredibly difficult, but they rose to the challenge. And so as we think about the workforce coming back in and what we can do to help those teachers, I think we have to respect both the stress and the innovation, and we need to talk about it and not so quickly rush, just as you referenced so beautifully, not rush to get back to that quote normal. As we've got a process here, and think back to the days of dating, and if you had a bad date, we didn't just tell one friend and let it go, right? We talked about it. We may still be talking about that epic, really bad date. COVID is kind of like that year. We're going to talk about this for the rest of our lives. And I think we want to give some time as we bring our staff back together and we come back together to give time to process that and talk about, celebrate those failures, those things that just went epically wrong that we can laugh about now and say, boy, technology, and that's obviously my demon, technology, woo, that, let's talk about that till we can laugh about it. Let's celebrate what we did that went right, because we really have reached out and embraced families in a way, a whole new way, and reached out to families and really created some new processes. A lot of people, just in terms of general workforce development, have talked about how we may be seeing shifts in where people work and how they work. And more people have said, wow, you threw a family-friendly workplace right in my face, and I hope we keep talking about that. We are poised to serve families that we may see working in a different work environment than we have the last 20 and 25 years and beyond. And I think we need to keep talking about those innovations and those things that went well, and talk about what we hated and talk about what we liked. I'm convinced that some of our teachers are going to come back and say, I found strengths in family communication that I didn't know I had. Like me, I think most of us get into early childhood because we love kids. Like I had no desire, and I say this all the time, I didn't care about working with big people. If you're over 4 feet tall, I'm like, goodbye. It took me a lot of my career to say, okay, I like working with parents. I like working with families. And I think we're going to find some providers who said, wow, this is my skill. This is my talent. I find energy in this. And how do we bring that back to our centers and say, we don't have a job called that. Do we, how do we maximize your talent and your potential? And I think addressing that in changing workforce is going to be a big thing. And then finally, I think we do want to pay attention to our providers' adjustment and fatigue. They may also be leaving children behind, or parents that they care for, or other family members they've come to care for. And we have to respect and honor that that is a very real adjustment that's happening while they carry the emotional burden of helping families and children adjust as well. So it's a lot for us to pay attention to in terms of professional development and support. And I think the amount of time that we just need to donate and give to this process of coming back. It took us a year. It's going to take us a year or more, I think, to be done talking about this. I don't think a couple of PD sessions will get us through it. We're going to tell these stories for the rest of our careers. So I think it's going to demand some time to really help us process and really support people as we bring everyone back to the classroom.
Could I just add to that? Yeah. And so I think when you said, Ginger, support, I'm thinking mental health, right? Across the spectrum, children, families, practitioners, leaders. And that could look, a variety of ways, right? And I think it needs to be, kind of, multifaceted, right? In the community, in schools, in curriculum, in practice, because you're right. I'm not sure that we're ever going to stop talking about this. I almost feel like when you hear about the baby boom generation, and it's like, back at the end of World War II, I really think that for generations, we're going to say, during COVID. So I think that I actually see it as an opportunity, particularly in communities where mental health and mental health services is kind of looked at, with some skepticism. And so I think that it is an opportunity to kind of embed those supports.
No, great thoughts. Thank you. So we're going to move on to Dr. Chester, and your question that we have for you is, how does inequity across races, ethnicities, and cultures impact all of this?
So it was actually already mentioned, a few of the different areas with the digital divide, where some families did not have technology when it came to even as a possible home care provider, and no longer having the capacity, no longer having the funding because parents may have lost jobs. There's just so many different aspects to this that really exacerbated the opportunity gap, which also then exacerbates the achievement gap. So there's so many different ways that when we look at not just culturally the resources that would be available if you had to go to another location because your parents were essential worker. And for lack of a better way of saying it, the ones that were able to hang in there and stay open didn't really match culturally with what you may have experienced when you were in a more warm, caring environment, because you related to those individuals. They had resources. They possibly knew your family background history. So a lot of those things are things that when we look at like just culturally, when we also look at race as far as who was actually being exposed, and in addition to who felt comfortable if you were maybe middle class and now you have to do more services that are public, or maybe you're having to fill out some forms, some government documents to get assistance, and you've never had to do that before. You don't know who to reach out to. You don't have like a safe place to be able to talk about some of the things that may be going on. Like there are a lot of different resources that you maybe didn't know were even available, because there was not just this um income gap that before it was only you weren't eligible for it, but now you don't even know where to go and what's even available. A true story, like 3 hours ago I went past a church that was giving out food and the police was directing traffic, and here we are a year and a month after the original pandemic. So there are still people that are suffering, and some are suffering in silence, because culturally asking for help can still be something that you don't do. So there are a lot of different race, ethnicity, cultural impacts that are affecting children, affecting adults, affecting providers, affecting communities. It's huge.
No, that's a great point, Dr. Chester. And so it's, as I'm thinking through this, I'd like to kind of pivot a little bit to you, Dr. Bailett, and ask you, how can families and providers help children process grief, and how can they, begin to process, because you're grieving a loss. A lot of us have experienced a loss of something. So how do we help one another do that? And especially, how do we help children through this process, processing the grief of, changing their routine, of, their school that might have closed, all of those different things.
Well, I would rely also on Dr. Welch to address that, but I'll
Yes.
say a couple of things. I think that, there are all different types of grief. And I think the pandemic has introduced a different sort of grief, because there's not a definitive end to the pandemic. And there are small losses for some people, for most of us, all the way through the experience. And then for other people, there have been enormous causes of grief, the worst being the loss of a family member, but certainly becoming homeless in the middle of this, or losing your job. Those are very tangible events that spark tremendous grief. But all of those little losses that pile up, and just the grief of not knowing when it's going to end, is a different kind of ongoing grief. And I think, the flip side of that grief is finding our resilience. And, I think one of the keys with resilience is that we need to all remember that we all have resilience within us. We may not feel it today, or we may have it today and it doesn't feel like it's there tomorrow, or we may have it when we're with our work colleagues, but when we go home, we're a mess and we're not resilient at all at home, or vice versa. It's not an all or nothing thing. And to draw upon our own resilience, but also to remember we're part of a large community of people. And if we're willing to reach out and try to support others, they're probably going to be willing to reach out and support us too. One of my favorite analogies, I've always loved trees, and I've read a lot about trees. And what I've learned is amazing. Similar trees in a forest, actually their root systems interconnect. And what they do is monitor each other's health And then they send messages in various ways chemically to one another about, you know, a pest that's coming down the pike or droughts. And they also can share and divert resources to the trees that are struggling. And they put a lot more of their resources into the young trees, for example. And if you think about that, that's what human society, that's what we should be doing for one another as well. I could say more, but I'm going to let Dr. Welch jump in here with her clinical psychology background.
I love that. I need to learn a lot more about trees. I did not know that, but it's I'm inspired on the spot. I think one thing we need to be prepared for our children who are grieving is probably the thing early childhood is best prepared for, and that is play, the language of the child, right? We do it better than anybody else. And so I think the one thing I would think I want us to have in our minds is to be aware of our own discomfort with that and not shut down play when maybe it needs to be expressed. And when I've worked with kids in trauma and early childhood settings, you know, one of the questions is always, well, if there was a big crash in the community, do we take all the cars out of the block center? Or, you know, if it was a big fire that, you know, some children died, do we take all the fire trucks out of the, you know, of the classroom? And my response is always, if a child needs to experience a crash, they will crash a block, they will crash a fork, they will crash their green beans. You know, if they need to reenact this, they will reenact it. So you don't need to put a lot of stimuli in the classroom, particularly to draw it out, but they will reenact it. And we can think about things. They may grieve, a parent may have gone from a day shift to a night shift. They may have had big changes in their economic system, you know, and that would maybe keep a parent out of a routine they've had. So they lost a routine of a parent being present at certain times. I think we'll see play themes about work, because job loss and job change has been such a big piece of this, about family members as people relocated or kind of live together, you know, to create bubbles or did not see other family members. So I think relational play is going to be a very big deal. And as children play, our own tendency sometimes is we get very uncomfortable as children approach dark issues, scary issues. And I think we have to go, okay, just because I'm uncomfortable as the grown up, they're doing something they need to do. And one of the best things we can do is to interpret their feeling there and say, you know, that sounds like it was scary, or that was hard, or I can tell you're sad that, you know, your mom is only home on the weekends now, or she doesn't tuck you in bed at night, or whatever that loss is. I think sitting with our own discomfort and giving them the words to narrate maybe what we're seeing them play out can be really important. And I think that's going to happen. I think that will happen naturally. And for those kids who have had a relationship loss for one reason or another, you know, the thing that heals relational pain is a relationship, you know, building that attachment. And I think for some of our kids, we're really going to see that we are those figures, you are those figures, and being there for them and being predictable and reliable and patient and nurturing and focusing on their needs is important. So I think we can follow the child a little bit on that, and they will show us some of that. And early childhood just plays into that so well, because it is our strength to let children express their feelings. And I think we just have to monitor our own to make sure we're letting them do what they need to do.
Thank you, Dr. Welch. And it reminds me of literally a year or so ago when this first happened. What is the first thing that was closed? Playgrounds, right? All of them. Big caution tape around every single playground you passed. Caution tape. And children don't understand why. And it wasn't being explained to them. It was just these big no signs, you know? And so in their mind, it's what's happening. That's their world. That's their zone, you know? And it was immediately taken away from them just like that. And it left a lot of families without any other option, you know, to provide that play space for them. So it made me think about that as we were talking, but we will keep going. This is a great discussion. So next question.
Nadia, I'll add one other thing. I'm just flashing back to what my 4-year-old granddaughter said last July to her mom. So she'd been out of childcare for, 4 months or whatever, 5 months. And she actually said to her one day, I feel like I'm forgetting what my friends' faces look like. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if she was or she wasn't, but the point is that was a grieving statement, but good for her. She could put it into words that made some sense that the parent could respond to. And I think giving children space to express in whatever way comes to their mind the losses that they're experiencing in an ongoing way is a really important part too.
Thank you. Next, we'll move to Dr. Hegde. If you can give us just one important step in charting a successful path forward. I know there are many, but just one step that you think is really important in terms of charting a successful path forward, especially for children. You're muted, Dr. Hegde. And then we'll go to you, Dr. Worry, for the same question.
I just realized, thanks. So, you know, I really want to, I know my my answer to the first question sounded very pessimistic, but of course that was a reality. So I want to really close on a positive note. So I personally, you know, there is an article that was just published by John Hopkins, which talked about you know, childhood positive experiences are very, very important for children. So we have to keep that at the back of our mind when we are going to be working with the children. And I want to give some concrete tips on how to kind of do that. And I'm going to put my teacher hat rather than a researcher hat and try to give you some concrete steps. I think having a safe and emotionally safe classroom, an emotionally sound classroom is going to be very important for children. That cozy corner that you have in your classroom can be put to good use. You know, helping children understand that taking time for yourself is okay, and it is a part of your classroom routine and guidance strategy is wonderful. Build that in your classroom. Genuine, supportive, high quality interactions, which we have always talked about, are more important today than ever. So please don't lose your faith in that. Love the children just like you have always done. You know, talk at that eye level, be interested in what they want to tell you, celebrate their successes, do an emotional check-in with the children every day, you know, and I did that as a teacher, and I know many of us do that. So, you know, that is wonderful. That is going to help children. Plan predictable routines, but be very accommodating, be flexible at the same time. That is very important. You need to be mindful of that. And last but not the least, you know, I know that a lot of teachers have shared this burden with the parents, is how do I connect with my families? You know, sometimes I'm wearing a mask and I can't talk, I can't reach my parents. You know, there are many ways. You can email them if they don't have technology access, send a folder to the parents. Parents know you are trying to do your best as well. So, you know, don't feel guilty. Try to connect with the parents as in the best way that you can. So these are some strategies I would state would be very powerful for children, families, and teachers.
Thank you. Same question to you, Dr. Worry.
Absolutely. You know, I would say, Nadia, first, it's just been a treat to watch in the chat, you know, all of the names and the locations of all of the early childhood educators who are on this call just sort of pop up throughout the hour. And what a treat it is to be with you all. I think if I had maybe two quick pieces of advice in terms of charting a path forward, you know, two, I think, very important things. One is not to get distracted by the current crisis of the day when it comes to education policy. And that is something that we've taken to calling learning loss. You know, learning loss, you know, sort of reminds me, remember several years ago when we, you know, it was sort of the popular thing in policy to talk about the importance of early childhood programs was so that we could be sure that kids came to kindergarten ready to learn. Right, as if no learning had happened for the first 5 years of their lives until they walked through that classroom door. And you know, I think very much the same holds true of this concept of learning loss. This overblown idea that children have not been learning and growing and developing over the course of the past year. Frankly, it's insulting to parents. It is insulting to the professionals who have been working with kids, albeit in some cases in a remote capacity over the past year. And it's very dangerous, I think, you know, particularly in early childhood, because I think there is this sense now that, you know, because kids have been away in some cases for so long from, you know, being in person in classrooms, that there is now this urgent rush to sort of catch them up on all of the things that they missed out on. And I just want to flag for all of you the danger that sort of poses for developmentally appropriate practice. And so, please don't allow yourself to be fooled into thinking that you have to, revert to inappropriate sorts of classroom practices. Rely on what you know about child development and about how young children learn and what their needs are, really now more than ever. And don't give in to this, this artificial idea that maybe they haven't had as many opportunities on certain discrete kind of academic skills, but they'll catch up. We know that that's the case. On a related note, though, I think the other thing that I just want to really caution against relates to classroom discipline and to social emotional development. And really, I'm not talking so much about the children's social emotional development as I'm talking about the teachers. One of the things that we know from a policy perspective over the past year is that tens of thousands, if not many more, I don't think we have an exact figure, but many children across the United States and in this context across the world have been out of kind of group-based settings over the past year and a half. By the time maybe we start pulling back together, we know that kindergarten enrollment is down in states. We know that pre-K enrollment is down. We know that demand for center-based childcare has dropped very precipitously. And so we do know that, one, that we may be seeing much larger numbers of kids enrolling in pre-K and kindergarten programs this year, for example, than we're used to. And we also know that those are kids who, may have in the short term had less, they may have developed other skills. They know how to run Zoom and they know how to self-regulate by muting at the appropriate time and those sorts of things. But they have in some cases lacked practice interacting with large groups of age level peers. And so I think it is especially important for teachers to go back into the in-person classroom with that in mind, and with an extra bit of discipline for themselves and an extra bit of sort of emotional grounding for themselves as to how they approach these behaviors. And I think always important to remember that social emotional development and self-regulation and the development of these executive functioning skills really is the curriculum of early childhood. And I think we are, in many cases, too quick to punish children or look at suspending or, God forbid, expelling young children from programs who haven't mastered these skills. I think that's, that's sort of like saying that, we're gonna expel you from a Spanish language class because you're not already fluent as a beginner, right? The purpose of this is that we are actively teaching and allowing children to develop these skills. And so I think, in the context of larger groups and the need maybe for some additional practice, that this is something that teachers are going to have to be especially vigilant about.
Thank you, Dr. Worry. We will, since our hour is almost up for the discussion before we jump into Q&A, let's go to call to action. I'll start with Dr. Welch. The call to action, if you can, in sharing with us your call to action for providers, tell us maybe two things that are happening in your state post-pandemic.
All right. Well, my first call to action, and this is something I don't know what we have going on in the state level, but I am declaring this the year of self-care for early childhood educators because the emotional burden on you is going to be tremendous. And we're doing a lot of kind of cognitive work with a lot of the teachers that I work with. And one of the shifts we're trying to promote is a shift from what does this child want to what does this child need? And that's exactly what Dr. Worry was just referencing, is the idea of our children are going to come in with emotional needs. If for nothing else, the transition, they're simply undergoing a big transition. Or quite frankly, their bedtimes have all changed, right? That's the other thing we're kind of working with people on is they had all sorts of different bedtimes. If you didn't have to get up and be anywhere, we saw sleep patterns change a lot for our little ones, and now they're going to change again. So we're going to have some sleep deprived children maybe. And so that is, I think, the year of self-care for our providers. We've got to emphasize self-care is every day. It is multiple times a day. It is distraction. It is relaxation. It is a cognitive shift in taking care of yourself. And it's going to have to be constant, because the pouring out to the children and families is going to be constant. And really reframing into, what does this child need? This child who is having a tantrum, this child who is clinging to me. What does this need mean? And to reinterpret those behaviors that we're going to see in very social emotional terms. And the other thing I think is to remember, and something that's been underscored the entire time here, is that, childcare was never just about the children. It was about the family system from the get-go. It was about the family, and this year really put them back in the focus. It's where we started, and they're back in the middle. And I think holding on to that and realizing we're going to have to keep reaching out to families. Some families are going to be very receptive, and others are not going to be receptive. But if we're going to benefit the child and build that resilience, I think reaching out and keeping up a good family program for parents who want to be contacted in all the different ways we know we can contact them. The power of a note, and I say this all the time to my students, the power of a thank you note or a thank you email, or I saw you, I love the way you squatted down to talk to your child. I love the way he is, hugging you so tightly when you drop him off. Those things matter, and they're going to matter to the big people, just like they're going to matter to our little people. And I think a lot of reinforcement, a lot of praise, a lot of I see you doing your best is going to heal a lot of little hearts and a lot of big hearts too. But we've got to pour into our providers. They've got to be full, as full as we can get them on their own social emotional health. And so that is my challenge to everyone, is spend this year on how to take care of our providers, and let's pour out into those families.
Thank you. Next call to action to Dr. Chester, and then next up, Dr. Morales-Alexander. Just if there's anything going on in your state that you'd like to share, or in your community, and then any call to action for providers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Jones. So I definitely think going back to talking about no longer learning loss, but unfinished learning, unfinished instruction. The latest term is really one of the things that, as we think about summertime, as we think about transitioning back into the regular school year for wherever you are in the country, if that's in August or if that's in September, it's something that, if we are not paying attention to community leaders who are the sources oftentimes of culturally relevant resources, whether that's human resources, whether that's physical resources, as in content with books and different pictures that students can relate to, and that families will feel more comfortable, even not just having inside of a classroom setting, but also at home. We know 85% of the child's time is spent outside of a classroom. So we have to be able to embed the community. So whether that is a local convenience store, the laundromat, like all of the different places where children have the opportunity to go, that our providers are also aware of that and know that if there is a concern that a family has, who are they actually feeling comfortable going to and talking to about that? So then that person is also educated as well, and there's a stronger relationship. And then embedded in that is also being able to give practical tips of reinforcing what's going on in that school setting at home, so that the person is also not feeling like, I can't do some of these things because, for example, it may need to be in a bilingual language, that it's sent, and that they're able to also help their child understand how to navigate two languages, and that it's okay if there are two languages that are, they're special. They have more than one. So again, that's, that opportunity to embrace that. And I believe bringing in the family, bringing in the school, and bringing in the community it takes a village, and we've got to continue to think that way.
Thank you.
So in response to this specific question, When I initially started thinking about this, I did not think, full transparency, I did not necessarily think about kind of what is happening locally in my area. I was thinking of it much more broadly because I think that it really just is a broad issue. And I think that COVID really shone a spotlight on it. And that is really on national level, state level, community level, program level, really thinking about how we value providers and value educators, right? And because it is a job, it is a calling, if you want, an art, however you want to couch it, that consistently and continually gets devalued. And I think that if anything during this pandemic, it's really brought to light how absolutely critical providers, practitioners, teachers, and programs are to community well-being, children well-being, consistency. And I think that throughout this time, if anything, they've received, providers receive mixed messages. It's like, we need you. They were, when everything shut down and they decided that, we need workers now, the first people that were called were, we need to open schools, we need to open programs. But yet, how many or how or to what depth were providers considered, their own fears, their own challenges, right? Of like, I'm a teacher, but I'm also a parent, and I'm a parent with 3 kids in 3 different schools. And like, do I want them to be in there, or I don't, I'm scared, and so on and so forth. And so there's kind of like that overarching piece of how are we valuing them? And related to that is that in many programs, I know from my experience here on the East Coast, many of our providers are 1 paycheck away from being a recipient of the services of the CBO that runs, that childcare program. And so we're talking about living wages, affordable housing, affordable healthcare, the same services that kind of we champion for children and families. Our providers deserve that. And deserve the recognition that they, of the work that they provide and the gift and what they bring to this. So that's my one point. My second point in terms of a call to action is, again, thinking about like professional development, self-development, learning, really understanding kind of the contexts in which children and families and even, practitioners themselves live in. I think I kind of go back to my own pre-service teacher experiences, kind of when I learned to be a teacher, and kind of what's happening in our programs, in our teacher preparation programs. We talk a lot about family engagement. Family and community engagement is important, but we're not taught how to build relationships with people. And that is really critical, right? Like those dispositions and skills, kindness, active listening, flexibility, taking on a different perspective, right? These are all disposition skills, practices that serve as a foundation to relationships. And more than ever, developing these skills and working in the spirit of reciprocal and authentic relationships, I think is really key.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we'll go to Dr. Hegde and then Dr. Worry.
So my response to this is, again, based on my lived experience, some research, and what I've observed. So my first thing I've realized is relationships matter more now than ever so. And there are wonderful ways in which you can build those relationships even online. I myself have attended some professional development workshops rolled out by Frank Potogram here in North Carolina, and I've enjoyed it. And I'm also I'm a teacher educator. So, I have to help my pre-service teachers. So, there are many beautiful PD opportunities out there. They're free. Please go ahead and, look for those kind of opportunities. It's there. I think the world has realized that it takes an extraordinary every person to be a teacher. And I think that's the positive of the pandemic. And I think the world has recognized that schools are important. It's not just a place where children learn. You also take care of children's needs, their physical needs, their socio-emotional needs. I think the world has recognized. I think this is a worldwide phenomena, truly. And last but not the least, I really because I do a lot of research and I'm doing a research related to COVID, I really like this one sentence which came from the literature, and it says that, and this is worldwide, they say, as hard it has been, we know that teacher dedication has not dwindled. Not to say it's not been hard, not to say they haven't been stressed, but it was wonderful to see that teachers are still committed to their children and doing the best. So I think, just like all the panelists have said, I think it's time for you to ask for grace for yourself and also do self-care and recognize that you are doing the best that you can. Don't be hard on yourself. I think that is a message that I think we are trying to give our teachers even at the state level. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr.
I'm
Roy?
going to piggyback just a little bit off of Dr. Hegde and Dr. Morales-Alexander, and I feel like I've maybe already given my call to action for providers, so I want to give a call to action really for everyone, but policymakers very much included, and that is that during the pandemic, I think we have learned better than ever about the importance of the early childhood workforce in this country. I think there's nothing that helps us to understand something's value quite like having it be gone. And that's sort of was the situation for a number of months. States closing down childcare through emergency orders and the like. I think on the plus side, it has been great during the pandemic. We have seen the early childhood workforce lifted up and called first responders, for example, and so lifted up alongside emergency medical personnel and law enforcement and those critical professions that I think the childcare workforce in particular is not always lumped into, wrongly so. So I think in some ways the value of the workforce has been highlighted. But boy, if there has ever been a better time to talk about the compensation of the early childhood workforce and the benefits provided. I mean, here, we had school districts, closing down out of fear for safety, and in truth, what happened is that danger wasn't mitigated. It was shifted onto a less compensated, workforce, primarily comprised of women of color. And so, we had, schools that were not operational, and instead, many of those children had to be, in early childhood types of setting and childcare. So, I think the time has really come. I think, people are understanding increasingly that this is a broken economic model that has been subsidized, largely on the backs of the workforce. And so, it is just my fervent hope and prayer that, as we come out of the pandemic, now that all of these things have been highlighted so abundantly, that we really take action once and for all to address the need for compensation, for healthcare benefits, and so on for the early childhood workforce.
Thank you, Dr. Rory. And closing us out with our call to action, Dr. Welch.
I kind of did mine earlier. I think it's just the self-care is what I'm really think people will, what I want to see people leave with this year is that emphasis on self-care and care for others, so that we can continue to care for others. So again, I'm going to keep pitching the year of self-care until we have a healthy, well-compensated workforce. I think we have our charge.
Thank you. And the hour went by fast, but that just goes to show you, once the conversation gets flowing, you're really just building on one another as we're discussing this very important topic. And it's just been a pleasure, having and listening and absorbing all of this information from you all this afternoon. We did get some great questions, so we will move right on into the Q&A portion. But before we do, I will see if Dr. Bailett has any other remarks that she'd like to add at this moment before we move on to Q&A.
Well, this has just been an incredible discussion, and my mind is whirling and spinning with so many thoughts and reacting. And thank you to all of you attending today for your wonderful comments and questions. I saw a lot of comments coming in when Dr. Worry started talking about this pressure that teachers are either putting on themselves or that they're afraid their systems and programs will put on them for immediately, catching kids up and compensating for all that learning loss, fast, and that they're going to be held accountable for that. And boy, that really lit up the chat box, Dan. So no surprise there. And, this is such a tough issue, but I think that everything you said about it to our audience is so appropriate and really helped folks in the audience maybe take a little bit of that pressure off themselves. The way I think about it, it is tragic that children may have lost some ground during this time. On the other hand, there's no magic bullet to instantly close that, nor do we need to feel like it has to be closed immediately, especially in early childhood. We can give them the gift of some time for this to happen more organically and naturally. I do think that programs need to have some urgency, not conveyed to the children, but some urgency to figure out where are the kids, because we need to start with where they are. So we'll need to figure out in a developmentally appropriate way, where are they? What resources do we need to deploy and how? So some urgency maybe at the system level, but that shouldn't translate to direct pressure on the teacher to be a miracle worker, and certainly shouldn't trickle down to children and sitting in desks and doing worksheets on math and literacy because they're behind. I mean, that is the absolute worst thing that can happen. So I don't know if anyone else wants to make a comment on that, because it was definitely a topic that lit up the chat.
Sure, yeah, that's fine.
In thinking about this idea of learning loss, I think we collectively really need to change the narrative, right? And going back to, what Dr. Worry said is that there isn't, this learning loss is relative, right? And that children, they're getting stuff, they're learning stuff, right? It might not be ABCs, or it might not be the traditional ways in which we even define learning, right? So I think that has to be part of the narrative change. And what I will say is that, let's be cognizant that here in the United States, right, racism and its related structures of inequities and social injustices has done far, far more to impact children's learning loss than COVID.
Yeah.
So.
No, I think that's a great point. It's a great point, and it's something that we cannot lose sight of. I worked for many years in a homeless shelter with children and families, and it was just amazing to see just how shocked a lot of our visitors were that the school was licensed and that it was accredited. And I never forget a volunteer. It's gonna make me cry. A volunteer came and she's walking through and she said, "The children are so clean." And that broke my heart because, I turned to her and I said, absolutely they are, because their parents want and demand the best for their children the same way that you do. And it was at that moment that I knew we needed to completely revamp our volunteer program, because these are things that we need to be talking about at the very, very initial point of contact, so that we can set the expectations for who they're coming to serve and support. Because that's where I saw we were missing the mark. But I was also upset because I'm like, why would you expect them not to be? you know. And so, yes, that problem has been very, very, very apparent in society before COVID, you know, and it is something that unfortunately is leaving many more families and children with even less of an opportunity to get out of, you know, these vice grips that they were in. But it can be done. You know, we have to demand it of our legislators, of our policymakers. You know, all the Capitol days and things like that that we're used to doing look very different now. I've done quite a few virtual ones, but we can still reach them. We can still tag them, hashtag all those things, and reach out to them, write the letters, send the emails. You know, their office reads them, they get them. But if they don't hear from us, then they're going to go on business as usual, continuing to sign off on budgets, sign off on bills and things like that, that are directly impacting the very educators and professionals that we support every single day.
Absolutely.
So that would be my, you know, call to action is we can't give up. We cannot give up. We have to continue to show up and show out and hold them accountable, because that's what we have to do to continue to be able to support these families and these children who are going to grow up. And they're going to remember this. They're going to remember this time, many of them, you know. So
and Dr. Jones, that's actually how, and for my organization, we were actually awarded over $7 million from our county because our school system actually did not have a plan for anything when they went virtual. So we were actually tasked with being the education equity hubs and having those hubs for the Black, Brown, low-income children because they were basically lost. There was no solution. And so we're even at this process now thinking about summer school is announced, but there's a 3-week gap in between. Where are children going? And then when summer school starts, it's 4 hours a day. What about the other time? And if we really believe in helping the children and families, that's the piece that we keep going back to as far as really being able to help with the unfinished learning that isn't just academics, it's also the social, emotional, and being able to get back into the process of what was the normal, but what's going to be the new normal.
Dr. Chester, you know, you really bring up an amazing point that I think so many of us and so many people think about education as just something that schools do. And yet when there's a calamity like this and a crisis like this, we realize how much we need other types of programs and other types of services to help provide that full experience for children when our business as usual suddenly doesn't work anymore. And it hopefully has helped us create more continuity of services and programs for children and families and shown us maybe some new potential pathways going forward to really provide a much higher quality whole experience for children and families, but only if we take that learning and build on it going forward. And I think, you know, that's one of the things I'm so hopeful about is that we've learned how to do some things differently and better, but that, you know, once the worst of the pandemic is over, there will be a natural tendency to go back to the way we used to do it. And I think that would be just the worst possible outcome. And I'll let others talk about.
I have a question that I think was really interesting that came through was how realistic is it to expect accurate testing outcomes for my special needs children ages 3 to 5 when some of them are still virtual and I've never met them in person, only through Zoom? Anybody have any thoughts?
I can, as a licensed school psychologist, I spent a lot of time thinking about, you know, assessing children and you know, there's just a tremendous amount of ethics that should come into play as we think about how and why we assess children that often get left out of the mix. And I think now more than ever, we need to think very, very, very carefully about why we are assessing children right now. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be assessing children, but we need to really, really think at a big picture level and at an individual program and child level, why are we assessing now? And if there's not going to be some clear benefit for that child, then we need to think long and hard about, from an ethical standpoint, whether we even need to do it. And related to that is, if we determine that we need to do an assessment because it offers a strong possibility of clear benefit for the child, how are we going to assess them, and with what instrument? But the most important question is, why are we even contemplating this in the first place?
I think that's a great point, and I've seen a lot of teachers really struggling with that, with the assessment piece, because there's still that pressure to provide the data, which for a lot of programs, depending on how they're funded, that's what you need, to validate the funding and to continue that stream of revenue for the organization. And so I just thought that was a very really good question that I know a lot of teachers and providers are very concerned about. Another question that we have in here are any books or resources that any of you can think of that can help children, or can help providers help children process loss and grief? Has anyone come across any literature or any resources or books or strategies that you have utilized that can help children process loss or grief in your lived experience?
So I immediately jumped back to play therapy, which is why I just knew Dr. Welch was coming in with something. Because that was one area with training for play therapy to initiate children having conversations, and parents or teachers being able to help with whether it is the G.I. Joe man, or whether or not it's drawing, or something with the sand. So just different figures and things. But I also know that a lot of families have more of the television as their resource than books, or than more tangible things. And so even stories about a different animal or something can also initiate that conversation. And I truly think that, similar to what was mentioned before, that children, when they express themselves and we're able to pay attention to how they are expressing themselves, then we're able to not give them too much information that is more mature than they can actually handle, but bring some closure to their curiosity that is age appropriate.
Thank you, Dr. Chester. And I see
love
some great resources coming up in the chat as well. So thank you for that. Continue to put those in there. Dr. Welch, did you have another comment?
Well, I was going to say, I had a long pause there because I was about to show my age, because the first 3 books that come to mind are ancient. Like Nana Upstairs, Nana Downstairs, they're classics. I consider them classics. Nana Upstairs, Nana Downstairs is a great book about death. The Fall of Freddie the Leaf. The 10th Good Thing About Barney. Like, okay, this is when I was learning to teach. So, right, we had actual picture, there were books, but the thing I do tell in my play therapy class is, go for the real literature, go for the beautifully illustrated picture books, go for those. Even though I'm in the psychology field, I can look at a book that was made for children by a children's author, and it is so much richer than what you can pick up that is a book about death. I mean, those have their place, but don't second guess yourself and go, I think I'll go with the one that was written by the psychologist. Go with the beautiful, go with that one that is going to appeal to the children. And just like Dr. Chester was saying, the creation of a narrative is also very powerful. So writing your own book about change, because death is a transformation, loss is a transformation. It is a part of life. And, I've seen children, again, write beautiful books, even group books. A Walk to the Pond, we saw a dead duck, and it's like, that wasn't really my plan to illustrate that, but okie doke. Here's what you want to draw out. Yes, those are bugs eating the duck. It's really not how I would do it. but I can't illustrate and I can't write books, and the children did a beautiful job. So I think there's something to helping them foster their expertise in that, and also looking to those classics and those new classics. But, follow your teacher gut. When it's a beautiful story, it will reach a child so much better than something that reads like a lecture. And I think that's what I would definitely stick to. Go for the quality.
Thank you. Thank you. And I see, again, a lot of good resources, coming up in the chat. So thank you all for continuing to share. One other question we have here, and there are many, but just trying to go through ones that we didn't touch on. What changes or modifications to practices have you made since COVID started that you're probably like, I'm gonna keep this, or this really works, or that you have, seen teachers decide, what, I kind of like this. I'll share one, with you, and teachers that I talked to about this. They're like, what, I think I'm gonna keep the mask thing. That works for me. I'm a lot less sniffly and all of that. So I'm gonna keep the masks. So I ask you the same question. Any things that have come about, practices that have come about since the pandemic that you find yourself, what, I'm gonna keep, or teachers that you support say that they'd like to keep?
Sure, I'd jump in there, Nadia, and say, during the pandemic, we've had to figure out lots of different ways to adjust, and many of them less than ideal, not things that we would want to continue, but just sort of by happenstance. But one thing that I think has happened during the pandemic that has changed maybe for the better is the use of technology to connect with meaningfully with families. I certainly wouldn't advocate for prolonged online instruction for young children, but I think back to my own time as a kindergarten teacher and think of the number of children whose parents I might have been lucky to have met for 10 minutes during the year, just very quick conversations in passing, if that. And so the use of FaceTime and Zoom and the need to kind of connect with families and have parents help to scaffold some of what's happening in online learning, I do think over the past year has really created strengthened bonds in a lot of cases between teachers and families. And boy, it's definitely something that I hope will continue.
I agree. Technology has been, you really realize just how much we rely on and need it. And so I think that's a great one. Any others, any other practices or other concepts that have come about that you're kind of like, yeah, this really works for me. I like to keep this.
Just the hygiene in general of washing hands. Like, unfortunately, we had to say it, but now just don't forget it. Like 5 years from now, keep washing your hands.
No, you're right. I'm kind of like, man, we can't find cleaning supplies now. What's been happening, before? And, they're cleaning the subways and train stations now. Was that not happening before? It just makes you think of all the things. Great point, Dr. Chester. Anyone else have any other?
I think I'm going to piggyback on what Dr. Dan just said. I have been I'm talking from the other side as a parent. I've been extremely pleased with the level of communication that has come my way. I get to know what is happening during the week, what is happening during the day. And that keeps me more connected with the school and the teachers than it has ever been. And I'm like, let them continue this. I know it's a lot of work, but it's wonderful to be that connected with the school. So I have actually enjoyed that over communication that has come from all different types of teachers. So good job, teachers. And I'm pleased as a parent.
Yeah, I see a comment in the chat that says drop off and pick up is outside checking temperatures. So I mean, that's a good thing. It's like, can we just do this forever? That kind of works for us because we kind of need to know, when you're coming in, how you're feeling, if you have a temperature, because we've all been there. I know when I was a teacher, you could literally, I had a little boy who you could see the Tylenol on his shirt that mom had kind of like covered up, and you could smell it. And so we dropped off, he's in there, he goes, Miss Nadia? And I said, yes. He goes, I don't feel good, but mom gave me the pink stuff. So I'm okay now. And we're like, okay. So called his mom. She's like, I'm so sorry. I just had a meeting. And I said, well, we're going to call you at nap time because that's when his fever is going to spike. And sure enough, but just, so yeah, I agree with you with that because I have lived and experienced that. So yeah, that might be a thing we keep. Any other ones before we close out? Yes, yeah. Dr. Morales.
I'd like to add two pieces. One is from my experience as a teacher, and what I'm hearing from my students. And so one of the strategies that my students have had to do in terms of their own classroom is to kind of create individual packets for children. So toys, manipulatives, and, you know, that sort of stuff. And so, you know, and of course, initially we're like grumbling because we're like, that's not early childhood education. Like, put the toys all on the table and like, you know, that's what we do. However, what it did do though, is that it really pushed my student teachers to be very intentional about what they were putting in those baggies and to individualize, right? And so really understanding, oh, you know, I know Nadia likes this and Dan likes this and Laura needs kind of support with this. And so then they started creating like these really individualized baggies. So for me as a teacher, you know, educator, I'm like, yes. And then relatedly with technology is while I totally miss being on campus and like being in the same space as my students, I think that one of the benefits is that I'm able to kind of jump on a Zoom call with students individually and kind of work with them in that way, that in a way that it just the whole busyness of before didn't allow for that. So I feel like those are two kind of win-wins.
Well, no,
Yeah.
thank you for that, and I agree with that fully. And yeah, there's a lot of things that, you know, we have discovered, you know what, this works. And I think that's the part of self-care, to Dr. Welch's point, you know, that it's just like, you know what, this works for me, this serves me and I like it, you know, or this does not, I don't want to do that anymore. So just acknowledging that and moving forward in that way, I think is definitely very healthy and helpful, because a lot of times we often don't think of ourselves first. We're often pouring, you know, into others so much that we're not pouring into ourselves or taking time away. So I just cannot thank you all enough for sharing your part of your afternoon, you know, with us and discussing these very important topics, among others. We certainly hope that you have been just ignited, you know, to move forward in new and different ways. And don't be afraid, you know, to ask those questions, you know, to be that squeaky wheel, because we need answers. You know, some of our families and children are still, you know, suffering and still need help. And the field still needs your support. You know, it still needs you, student teachers, parent educators, the like. So we just cannot thank all 500 plus of you for being here this afternoon. And it will be recorded, or is being recorded, and will be shared with you in the coming days for you to review and share with your colleagues. So please do. But with that said, we thank you all, and we will close it out here. And panelists, we will just hang back and kind of recap briefly. But thank you everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.